Have you ever stopped to think that the most boring routine in history might actually be the greatest secret to finding peace and mental clarity? While today we constantly chase productivity, goals, and stimulation, there was a time when men chose to live in silence, repeating simple tasks without rushing or distraction. And oddly enough, this monotonous life was precisely what gave them strength, focus, and serenity. It may sound strange, even controversial. How can someone be happy waking up before the sun, eating stale bread, working the land, and repeating the same prayers every day? Well, yes, but it's precisely in this lifestyle, which seems dull to our modern eyes, that a powerful key lies hidden, a key that can help you slow down, and who knows, even sleep better. The curious thing is that all this happened centuries ago, within stone walls, in medieval monasteries. There, every detail from the bell that echoed at dawn to the Gregorian chant that rocked the night had a purpose. Nothing was by chance. And when we look more closely, we discover lessons that still make sense for our lives, here and now. So before we begin this journey through the past, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I want to know how far this story will go. In medieval times, when life was hard, unstable, and marked by war and famine, the need arose for a space where the spirit could breathe. This is when monasteries emerged, small havens of peace, isolated from the outside world. Imagine living in a place where the clock isn't a clock, but a prayer. The day begins even before sunrise, with the silence broken only by the sound of a deep bell echoing across the fields. This seemingly monotonous routine concealed a silent revolution. Saint Benedict, a man who lived in the 6th century, realized that maintaining discipline required more than good intentions. He wrote a manual, the famous Rule of Saint Benedict, which structured the monks' lives in a rigid but practical way. No excesses, no luxuries, just balance, work, pray, rest. It's that simple. Nowadays, when someone talks about a productive routine, they hardly realize the essence of it. Idea was already written over 1,000 years ago. The beauty of this system was precisely its repetition. Ora et labora, pray and work, became almost a motto. And you see, it wasn't just spirituality. There was a very human purpose behind it, to bring order to a chaotic world. While kings fought over territories and peasants lived at the mercy of the weather, the monks found stability. It was like having an instruction manual for living well, even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. If you think about it, it's like that modern habit of creating checklists or planners to organize your day. Who hasn't tried using a productivity app or even a simple notebook to stay on top of tasks? Well, monks already did this, but in a spiritual and communal version, they showed that discipline doesn't have to be a prison, but can be a form of freedom. Interestingly, what seemed boring was precisely what brought peace. Getting up early, repeating prayers, breaking bread, cultivating the land. Banal activities became tools to keep the mind and heart in balance. Today, many people seek this peace through practices such as meditation, yoga, or even spiritual retreats. Deep down, the quest is the same, to find serenity within the noise of the world. And of course, this beginning was just the foundation of something much greater, because if the origin brought rules and structure, what came after would show how these men transformed discipline into knowledge, art, and even power. After all, the bell that called to prayer also marked the rhythm of an entire life. Medieval monasteries lacked the ostentation seen in Gothic cathedrals, filled with stained glass windows and towers that seemed to touch the sky. They were more humble, built of stone, wood, and lime, with straight lines and almost no ornamentation. But this simplicity wasn't a lack of creativity, It was purpose. Every wall, every arch, every corridor had a practical function to protect, shelter, and facilitate silence. It's like that small but well organized house where everything seems to be in its right place. The monks knew that the mind is easily distracted, and so they avoided the superfluous. No giant windows that allowed the gaze to escape to the world. No bright colors that disrupted concentration. Sobriety reigned here. A modern visitor, accustomed to shopping malls full of lights and stimuli, might even find it dull. But deep down, this architectural monotony was the key to immersing oneself. The spaces were divided almost mathematically, the cloister in the center, surrounded by corridors, the church facing the sunrise, the dining hall, simple but always clean, the shared dormitories, silent as libraries. Even the kitchen had rules, no extravagance, just the essential. Imagine living in a place like that today, with no TV in the living room, no cell phone next to the bed, no ads flashing in front of you. Strange, perhaps liberating. The construction was also designed to withstand the element. Thick walls protected against the cold, sloping roofs to allow rain to drain away, and internal courtyards for ventilation. There was no luxury, but there was durability. Many of these monasteries, in fact, remain standing to this day, defying centuries of war and inclement weather. This makes us wonder, will what we build today, full of glass and metal, last as long as the stones they patiently laid? And the curious thing is how this simplicity ends up inspiring even today. Think of modern minimalism, the trend of having lighter homes with fewer objects, fewer distractions. It's as if we're rediscovering in the 21st century something monks already practiced 1,000 years ago, the idea that less can be more, less color, less noise, less excess, more essence. This silent architecture paved the way for something even more profound, the way time was organized within those walls. Because it's not enough to just have solid walls, you also need a steady rhythm for the life that happens within the time. Inside a medieval monastery wasn't measured in minutes and seconds as we do today. There were no wristwatches or digital alarm clocks. There, the day was guided by the so-called canonical hours, a system of prayers that marked each moment of the day. The bell would ring, and everyone knew it was time to pray. Imagine a chiming clock, where each chime not only reminded you of what to do, but also the meaning of life. These prayers began in the early hours of the morning, in the darkness of night. They called them vigils when the mind was drowsy, but the spirit sought to be awake. Then came lauds at sunrise, bringing with it the idea of a new beginning, of hope, of a new day. It's curious to see how we, today, also seek out these rituals. Some drink strong coffee early in the morning, others turn on their cell phones to check messages. The monks, for their part, began in silence, in prayer. As the sun rose, new prayers organized the routine. Terse, each was a reminder that time doesn't slip away in vain, but can be filled with intention. While today we rush between meetings, deadlines, and notifications, the monks knew exactly where they should be and what they should do at each hour. The bell wasn't just a metallic noise, it was like an inner compass. And the most fascinating thing is that this division wasn't just religious, it structured the entire day: when to eat, when to work, when to rest. It was almost like a calendar app, only made of stone and bronze. Anne, who's tried to organize their life with time blocks, like studying in the morning, working in the afternoon, resting in the evening, knows how much clarity it brings. While monks had this method long before we had colorful planners, beyond rhythm, there was also intention. Each prayer had its own theme, asking for strength, giving thanks, seeking wisdom. This gave depth to the day, making it not just an automatic repetition, but a cycle full of meaning. It's as if each interval were a conscious pause, something modern life often robs us. Today, stopping for 5 minutes already seems like a luxury. Imagine stopping 7 times throughout the day just to realign your soul. This prayerful rhythm was so powerful that it even shaped the way the monks perceived the world. The sun, the bird song, the sound of the wind, everything fit into this sacred calendar. And so their lives became a kind of living clock, in tune with heaven and earth. But of course, for this rhythm to be remembered, there was always one essential detail: the deep, imposing sound of the bell. The monastery bell wasn't just a bronze object hanging in a tower, it was the voice of time. When it rang, its echoes carried through the cold stone corridors down to the cloister and out into the surrounding fields. Each chime brought with it a reminder: get up, pray, eat, work. There was no ignoring it. It was a deep, low sound that seemed to penetrate the bones and organize even the most scattered thoughts. For those who lived there, the bell was the most accurate timepiece. It didn't matter if the sky was cloudy, if it rained or snowed, if the sun was shining brightly. The bell never failed. Imagine today, if instead of a cell phone notification, a bell dictated the rhythm of life. It would be strange at first, but perhaps liberating. After all, instead of messages, likes, and demands, the sound would call for moments of silence, prayer, and presence. There was also something almost poetic about this ritual. The bell not only organized time, it united the monks. Everyone, upon hearing the same sound, would drop what they were doing and head toward the same place. It was like a collective symphony, where each person had their own role. The sense of community, of belonging to something greater, is something many people seek today, in groups, clubs, or even on social media. And note a curious fact: the bell needed no words. There were no announcements, no shouted order, just a metallic sound echoing through the air that said it all. This shows us how discipline can be transmitted simply, without pressure, without fanfare. It's different from today, when we need vibrating alarms, flashing notifications, and busy schedules to remind us what to do. The monks had only one bell, and it was enough. The curious thing is that, over time, this sound became part of each monk's identity. Some said they could even distinguish the rhythm of the chimes, as if it were a unique signature. It was more than a call. It was a link to the divine, a constant reminder that life followed a greater rhythm. Anyone who has heard the bell of an ancient church knows there is something solemn, almost hypnotic, that captures the attention and silences the soul. And so, the bell, with its imposing and repetitive presence, marked the path of the day. But even before it rang, there was already a first challenge: waking up when the body still begged for bed, but discipline called for prayer in the darkness of dawn. Awakening in the monastery didn't happen with the rooster's crow or the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. It happened before that, in the still heavy silence of dawn. The cold stone of the dormitory was the body's first contact with reality. The monk, wrapped in a simple habit, rose slowly, still drowsy, but obedient. There was no time for laziness, no room for just 5 more minutes. The bell tolled, and the routine began. For them, rising before the sun was an act of discipline and dedication. The body begged for bed, but the spirit was invited to awaken to something greater. It's curious to think that today, many seek the so-called miracle morning, waking up early to meditate, read, or exercise. Monks had been doing this for centuries, but without any fad. For them, waking up early was less about productivity and more about spirituality. The shared dormitory was not luxurious.
rows of simple, rustic wooden beds without soft mattresses or warm blankets like we have today. It was the bare minimum for rest. The cold, dense early morning air bit at the skin, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the stone floor. This setting, which to us might seem uncomfortable, to them was part of the preparation. The body learned to be strong in simplicity. The first thing you felt after waking up was silence. No conversation, no distractions, just the sound of walking toward the chapel. Imagine waking up without picking up your phone, without checking messages, without external noise, just you, the morning chill, and the sound of your own heart. It sounds strange, but it can be profoundly restorative. Their awakening was a pause, a transition between sleep and an encounter with the sacred. This habit of waking up early created a sense of advantage over the world. When the sun finally rose, the monks were already in prayer, having already given meaning to the early hours of the day. Today, when someone wakes early and sees the city still asleep, they feel a certain silent power, that of being one step ahead. It's almost a secret shared only with the dawn. And so, amidst the cold, discipline, and dedication, the monks began their journeys. But it wasn't just waking up early that mattered. Right after waking came the first spiritual commitment, the night prayer that officially opened the day's cycle. In the darkness of dawn, when the outside world still seemed asleep, the monks gathered for the office of readings. It was a long, solemn prayer, marked by the deep sound of Gregorian chant echoing off the stone wall. Torches illuminated the space with a yellowish glow, creating shadows that danced across the cloister. The cool air carried the scent of burning wax and incense. Everything about this space invited deep reflection, almost as if time had stood still. This nocturnal moment wasn't meant to please the body, but to train the soul. While many were still dreaming, they awakened their spirits to immerse themselves in psalms, biblical passages, and meditations. It was as if each word, repeated in unison, was another brick in the inner construction. Today, when someone reads an inspiring book before bed or upon waking, they experience a bit of that same power, nourishing the mind instead of letting it drift. The office of readings also carried powerful symbolism. Praying in the dark meant trusting that light would come sooner or later. It was an exercise in hope. Anyone who has gone through difficult times knows how profound this gesture is, maintaining faith even when everything around seems dark. There, each monk learned to see beyond what the eyes could see, as if training an inner vision. Beyond the spiritual value, there was also the collective effect. Everyone sang together in a slow, almost hypnotic cadence. The uniform rhythm made each person feel part of something larger. There were no individual voices standing out, just a chorus that sounded like a single organism. This practice is very reminiscent of the strength we feel when we participate in something as a group, a crowd in a stadium, a choir, or even a crowd singing the same song at a concert. But there was an important difference. In the monastery, this chant didn't seek fleeting excitement, but rather constancy. It shaped the spirit for the discipline of the entire day. Imagine starting your journey with something that doesn't give you adrenaline, but serenity. That was the key. Instead of bursts of energy, it cultivated a solid calm, resilient throughout the hours. Thus, dawn wasn't just an annoying detail of the routine, it was the foundation upon which the rest of the day would be built. Because right after this nightly prayer came one of the most silent and challenging rules of monastic life, the constant practice of absolute silence. In the medieval monastery, silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the presence of attention. The monks learned to be silent, not to isolate themselves, but to listen to themselves, to listen to others without interruption, to even the discreet sounds of nature that surrounded the wall.
Imagine a place where, instead of the noise of cars, notifications, and crosstalk, all you could hear was the wind, the creak of a door, or the light tread of sandals on the stone floor. This was the daily scene. The discipline of silence helped tame the human impulse to speak without thinking. How often today do we speak for the sake of speaking, repeat automatic phrases, or get lost in pointless arguments? In the monastery, every word had value, so it was used sparingly. Silence became a kind of filter. Perhaps that's why, even amidst simplicity, their minds could plumb depths that the hectic life outside rarely allowed. Mindfulness practices, which seek to slow down and pay attention to the present. When a monk spent hours in silence, he wasn't just not talking. He was training himself to inhabit the present, to feel the weight of his own body, to notice his breath. If we think about it, we can still experience something similar today, turning off our cell phones, walking in a park, or simply listening to the water boiling for coffee without rush. There was also a significant social effect. The silence created an atmosphere of mutual respect. It wasn't an oppressive silence, but a shared silence. Imagine walking into the cafeteria and hearing only the clink of cutlery against plates while someone quietly read from a book. There was no gossip, no distractions, just a harmonious collective presence. This kind of environment shaped not only the spirit, but also the coexistence. Of course, it wasn't easy. The human instinct is to speak, express oneself, and react. Many novices found it strange at first, feeling suffocated by the lack of conversation. But over time, they learned to transform this difficulty into strength. They discovered that silence isn't empty, but a fertile space. It's where ideas, reflections, and even solutions are born that noise would never allow to emerge. How many times have we found answers after being quiet, alone, thinking, because the monks lived in this state, constant, and as silence became a natural part of the routine, he prepared his mind for another essential aspect of monastic life: simplicity, even in the clothes they wore, discreet symbols of a life that avoided any form of vanity. The monk's clothing was not designed to impress. No fine fabrics, sophisticated embroidery, or vibrant colors. The habit was made of thick wool, usually brown or black, and its main function was to cover and warm. That was all. The simplicity of the garment already conveyed a silent message. Here, no one was more important than anyone else. There was no room for vanity or ostentation. Everyone dressed alike, like parts of a single collective body. Interestingly, this uniformity was very reminiscent of the modern idea of having a capsule wardrobe, with a few, always functional pieces that avoid wasting time choosing what to wear. While today we talk about productivity by eliminating unnecessary decisions, the monks already practiced this without realizing it. Clothing was one less decision. There was energy left for what really mattered: prayer, work, and inner discipline. The rough fabric, however, was a constant reminder of renunciation. There was no luxurious comfort in the touch of raw wool. Every day, the body felt the difference between what could have been soft and what was actually worn. This choice wasn't a punishment, but an exercise in humility. It's like when someone chooses to walk instead of using the car, not because they need to, but to learn from the simplicity of the gesture. Every discomfort there had a purpose. Furthermore, the habit carried symbol. The cord at the waist recalled the vows taken. The hood worn during prayer reinforced the sense of seclusion. Everything made sense. Even the neutral color helped create an environment free from visual distraction. Imagine entering a space where everyone wears the same outfit. The eye doesn't dwell on trivial details, and attention is drawn to the essential. This was the daily effect in the monastery. It's interesting to note how, outside of that world, clothing has always been a tool of status, power, and differentiation. In castles, Silks and jewels spoke louder than words. In the monastery, the opposite was true. Custom firmly stated that no one was better than anyone else. This lesson incidentally remains relevant today. How often do we judge someone solely by their appearance because their appearance was purposefully overlooked and only character was highlighted? This simplicity of dress, far from being merely a detail, was part of a larger routine of discipline because besides praying and dressing humbly, the monks had another fundamental mission: to dedicate part of their day to reading and copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge for the future. Inside monasteries, reading and copying manuscripts was almost a sacred act. Imagine rooms lit only by flickering candlelight, where monks hunched over wooden tables in absolute silence, quills dipped in dark ink. Each word copied was done with infinite patience, as if it were a written prayer. The most common sound there was not conversation, but the scratching of quills on parchment. These monks weren't just writing for the sake of writing. They preserved the memory of humanity, biblical texts, yes, but also works of philosophy, science, and literature from antiquity. Without this work, much of what we know today of Aristotle, Plato, or Cicero would simply have disappeared. It's curious to think that while kings and nobles fought for power, anonymous monks ensured that knowledge would endure through the century. The act of copying required almost superhuman discipline. Any mistake was corrected with effort, because erasing ink on parchment was difficult. Many manuscripts even bear small notes written by monks in the margins, discreet confessions. "It's cold here," "My hands hurt," or even "Finish this book quickly." These details reveal the human side behind the serious, who hasn't found themselves tired of a repetitive task, but knowing they needed to finish it. Besides preserving knowledge, the habit of reading nourished the spirit. Each monk read daily, silently, reflecting on each sentence. There was no rush, no quick summary. Time, there, was an ally of wisdom. It's almost the opposite of our era, where we seek short videos, instant summaries, and news in 40 characters. The monk read slowly, savoring the words like one savoring a rare wine. Interestingly, this slow pace had profound effects. By devoting hours to a single text, the monk truly immersed himself in the content, allowing the ideas to shape his thinking. Today, when someone reads a good book without distractions, be it Marcus Aurelius's Meditations or even Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, they experience something similar: an intimate connection with ideas that transcend time. And so, between copied books and silent reflections, monasteries became true beacons of knowledge in a time of darkness. But discipline wasn't limited to the mind. The body also needed to be tamed, and this happened, in part, through strict rules of fasting and restricted eating. In the monastery, eating was never an act of pleasure. It was a necessity, regulated by strict rules. The monks practiced frequent fasts, not only as a physical sacrifice, but also as a spiritual discipline. The table was simple: brown bread, vegetables, some seasonal fruits, and on rare occasions fish. Red meat was almost never served. Eating was almost a silent ritual, without excess, without haste, just enough to keep the body going. This self-control was part of the philosophy that the body should not dominate the spirit. After all, how often does excess food or drink leave us sluggish, drowsy, and mentally unclear? In the monastery, this was precisely what was avoided: excess. Today, we call it mindful eating, or even intermittent fasting. Modern practices that seek health, but which monks had already practiced for centuries, not out of fashion, but out of faith. The curious thing is that by limiting food, they also valued each meal. A piece of bread tasted like a feast. A bowl of hot soup on a cold day was almost a divine gift. This insight reminds us how, in modern life,
We are surrounded by abundance, yet we often lose sight of the value of a simple meal. The monk, with his minimal diet, invites us to rediscover the beauty of the essential. There was also a symbolic detail. Fasting was seen as a form of purification. It wasn't just the stomach that was emptied, but also the heart. The act of giving up food helped make room for prayer. Anyone who has experienced going a few hours without eating in silence knows how the senses sharp, the smell of the air, the sounds of the environment, even one's emotions seem more intense. It was in this state that the monks immersed themselves in spirituality. Of course, it wasn't easy. Many novices found hunger strange, feeling weak or discouraged in the early days, but little by little, they learned that the body is more resilient than we imagine. This learning, in fact, was training for life, enduring discomfort in pursuit of something great. Today, when someone resists the temptation to spend unnecessarily or disciplines themselves to study instead of procrastinating, they do a similar exercise. And so, fasting, far from being merely a dietary rule, became a pillar of all monastic life. But it wasn't just in eating that discipline was practiced. Even in the refectory, during the few meals, there was a curious detail. No one talked, and the silence was filled with another form of nourishment, this time for the mind. In the heart of the monastery, the refectory was more than a place to satisfy hunger. It was a space of discipline and learning. The monks sat side by side at long wooden tables, with no tablecloths, no fine cutlery, just simple plates and clay bowls. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of cutlery and the calm voice of a brother assigned to read aloud. Eating and learning simultaneously formed a unique experience. This reading wasn't random. It often featured passages from the Bible, stories of saints, or even philosophical and moral texts. While chewing stale bread or sipping hot soup, the monks nourished not only their bodies, but also their minds. It's curious to note how, today, many people listen to podcasts during meals or watch educational videos while eating. In a way, we're repeating the same idea, transforming an ordinary moment into a learning opportunity. The atmosphere had a solemn quality. The sound of the voice echoed off the stone walls, and each word seemed to weigh more than the spoon in hand. The discreet sound of spoons hitting plates created a cadence that blended with the reading. There were no distractions, no loose laughter or side conversations. It was a silent communion, a collective experience that united everyone in a single rhythm. And behind this, there was a lesson in humility. No one chose the menu. No one complained about the meal. No one questioned the reader. Whatever came was received with gratitude. It's a stark contrast to today's life, where we often get irritated if the dish takes too long or if the food isn't exactly as we imagined. In the monastery, learning to accept was part of the spiritual training. Furthermore, the habit reinforced the idea that time is precious. Even eating was free from frivolity. Every moment was used to grow, whether spiritually or intellectually, and in a way, this custom can inspire us. How about transforming meals into moments of value? Read a few pages of a good book, listen to something uplifting, or even practice gratitude in silence before eating. Thus, the refectory was not only a place of sustenance, but also of learning. And after eating and reflect, the monks move on to another essential part of their routine, manual and agricultural labor, which kept the monastery self-sufficient and in harmony with the land. When the meal ended and the bell rang again, the monks exchanged the silence of the walls for the silence of the field.
There, among vegetable gardens and plantations, Agricultural work was a fundamental part of life. No machinery, no modern shortcuts, just hoes, shovels, and calloused hands. The sound of iron striking the hard earth mingled with birdsong, and the fresh scent of freshly turned soil filled the air. For them, cultivating the land was as sacred as reciting a prayer. Farming wasn't just about survival, it was also a spiritual discipline. Every seed sown carried a lesson in patience, planting today without rushing to harvest tomorrow. This same principle can be seen in modern life in any long term project. Learning a language, investing in education, or even taking care of one's health. Everything requires consistency, small daily actions that only show results later. And there was also a very strong sense of community. No monk worked alone. Some tended the vegetable gardens, others the orchards, others the vineyards. The collective effort allowed everyone to support themselves together. It's like when a family plants a garden in the backyard, or when neighbors help with a renovation. The result is not just food or a finished project, but a stronger bond between everyone. The fields also offered a significant contrast to the confines of the walls. Under the open sky, the monk felt the wind on his face, the heat of the sun burning his skin, the earth running through his hands. It was a complete sensory experience. Today, many people seek this connection through urban gardens, trails, or practices like therapeutic gardening. The simple act of working the earth remains, centuries later, an antidote to the rush. Interestingly, despite being laborious, this craft brought a sense of freedom. As they dug, watered, and harvested, the monks felt connected to creation. It was like participating in a divine cycle. The earth gives, humanity tends, and life is renewed. Many describe this activity as a silent prayer, in which each gesture of planting or harvesting was a wordless dialogue with God. And of course, agricultural work was only part of what sustained the monastery. Besides the fields and gardens, there were also workshops where the monks transformed their skills into useful, handcrafted, and durable objects. The monastery gardens were veritable laboratories of patience. There grew onions, garlic, cabbages, and aromatic and medicinal herbs, all arranged in well-kept rows. The scent of moist earth, mixed with the freshness of the leaves, created a calm, almost therapeutic act for the monks. Tending the garden was more than just producing food. It was learning, day after day, that life flourishes in simplicity. This work required discipline, but also delicacy. It wasn't enough to simply dig the earth. One had to observe the cycles of the moon, the weather, and the seasons. It was a kind of practical wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Today, when someone decides to plant basil in a pot on the balcony or tomatoes in a small backyard, they relive, albeit on a smaller scale, that same connection with nature. Cultivating vegetable gardens ensured not only fresh food, but also natural remedies. Rosemary, sage, chamomile, and many other herbs were used to relieve pain, treat colds, or soothe the spirit. Imagine a monk preparing a hot infusion on a cold night, the steam slowly rising from the clay mug. It was a simple, accessible, yet powerful medicine. Interestingly, the phytotherapy that is now gaining popularity again was already routine in the medieval cloister. Beyond its practical utility, there was profound symbolism. Tending to the garden was like tending to the soul. Pulling weeds reminded us of the need to eliminate bad habits. Watering the plants taught the importance of nurturing virtues. Harvesting the fruits showed that all effort will one day bring rewards. Anyone who has cared for a plant knows how rewarding it is to see a tiny seed transform into life. For the monks, this experience was a silent prayer, and there was also sharing. The garden served not only to feed the monks, but also to help travelers, the poor, and the sick, who knocked on the monastery's door. What grew from the earth was multiplied in generosity. Today, when we see community garden projects in neighborhoods or schools, we realize how this practice continues to be a symbol of unity and collective care. Thus, between patient cultivation and bountiful harvests, the vegetable garden was the monastery's verdant heart. But not everything was confined to the land. Within the workshops, the monks also dedicated themselves to manual labor, creating useful objects that sustained community life. Inside the monastery, it wasn't just the land that yielded fruit. There were also workshops, where the silence was transformed by the sound of hammering, sawing wood, molding clay, or looms working leisurely. The smell of wood dust mingled with that of wet clay, creating a unique atmosphere. There, each monk put his hands to work for the community, transforming simple raw materials into useful, lasting, and often beautiful objects. Carpentry produced tables, benches, doors, and even parts of churches. Everything was handmade, with care and precision. Nothing was disposable, nothing was rushed. A well-crafted piece of wood could last decades, spanning generations. It's impossible not to compare it to modern life, where so many things break quickly because they were built to last. The monks, unbeknownst to them, were already practicing sustainability. In pottery, clay was shaped into bowls, jars, and vases that served both in the dining hall and for food storage. The process was slow, kneading, molding, drying, and firing in the kiln. Each step required patience. Perhaps that's why each piece carried symbolic value. It wasn't just useful, it was an expression of discipline. Today, when someone dedicates themselves to a manual art like pottery, they feel the same, the pleasure of creating something tangible in an increasingly virtual world. Weaving, on the other hand, produced habits, blankets, and everyday fabrics. The rhythmic sound of the loom was almost musical, reminiscent of a prayer in motion. Weaving thread by thread, the monks learned that nothing great is built all at once. It is always the result of small action. It's a lesson that applies to any goal: studying, undertaking, creating something new. Everything begins with small, repeated gestures. These workshops also served a social purpose. Many objects were sold or traded, generating resources to support the monastery or help those in need. It was a way of transforming work into charity, skill into generosity. Anyone who visits an ancient monastery can still see these traces: rustic benches, simple utensils, coarse fabrics, all bear the mark of the anonymous hands that created them. And so, among wood, clay, and thread, the monks demonstrated that work was as noble as prayer. But life in the monastery wasn't confined to the inside. It also had a mission to welcome those arriving from outside, especially travelers and pilgrims seeking shelter within its doors. The monasteries, scattered along roadsides and in isolated regions, were more than centers of prayer. They were refuges for travelers, weary pilgrims, merchants on the move, the homeless. All could knock on the door and find shelter. There was no lavish reception, no comfortable beds, but there was a sincere welcome. The sound of the wooden gate opening, the smell of hot soup in the refectory, the monk's calm gaze, these were enough to make a visitor feel safe. Hospitality was not just charity, but part of the monastic rule. It was believed that each pilgrim could be Christ himself visiting in disguise. Therefore, even strangers, they were received with respect and dignity. Today, when we talk about hospitality, we often think of hotels or paid services.
In the monastery, hospitality was a spiritual duty. A simple lesson: to welcome others is to welcome the divine. Of course, comfort was minimal: shared rooms, straw beds, rough blankets. Still, for those who had just walked for days in the dust and cold, it was like a gift. The clean water, a plate of bread and soup, the silence of the cloister, all of this replenished our strength. It's similar to the feeling we get when someone offers us a glass of ice-cold water on a scorching day. Simple but unforgettable. Many pilgrims left stories in exchange for lodging. They recounted miracles, news of distant lands, rumors of war. For the monks, hearing these tales was almost a window to the outside world. Imagine living for years within the same walls and suddenly hearing tales of distant kingdoms, different cultures, and strange customs. It was a valuable exchange. The monks offered shelter and received stories, and there was also the symbolic side. By welcoming, the monastery became a bridge between the sacred and the mundane. The traveler, resting there, took not only bread and water, but also a bit of the serenity of that environment. How many, upon returning to their homeland, haven't carried with them the memory of a place where time seemed lighter and life simpler? This impact was silent but profound. Thus, every guest who passed through the gates was part of the mission to serve. But care wasn't limited to healthy travelers. The monasteries also extended their hand to the sick and poor, transforming themselves into small hospitals of faith and compassion. In medieval monasteries, charity wasn't just theory, it was daily practice. The sick and the poor were welcomed with the same seriousness as prayers. The monks, even without modern medical training, offered herbal remedies, simple dressings, and above all, attention.
Imagine arriving weakened after days on the road and finding not only a makeshift straw bed, but also someone who listened to your pain in compassionate silence. The monastery functioned as a sort of rudimentary hospital. There were no sophisticated instruments, but there was accumulated knowledge. Herbs grown in the gardens were used for teas, ointments, and compresses. Chamomile calmed, mint soothed, sage healed wounds. It was natural medicine, applied patient. Today, when we talk about natural remedies or alternative therapies, we are actually reviving practices that were already part of the monastic routine. Centuries ago, beyond the body, the soul was cared for. The sick received prayer, spiritual comfort, and a look of faith. It was comprehensive care, in which physical health and hope went hand in hand. Many accounts from the time mention pilgrims who, more than an improvement in their illness, took with them the feeling of having been treated as human beings, a rare thing in an unequal society. This detail shows how charity can be more powerful than any medicine. For the poor, care came in the form of bread, soup, and shelter. The monastery was seen as a safe haven against hunger. What little they had was shared, because the rule was clear: no one should be sent away empty-handed. It's almost impossible not to compare them to the food banks or soup kitchens we have today. The logic is the same: share so that no one suffers alone. This work, however, was not easy. The monks also dealt with contagious diseases, open wounds, and extreme suffering, and yet they did not back down. There was risk, but there was also purpose. Serving others was serving God. This mentality challenges us. How many times have we avoided helping for fear of getting involved, while they exposed themselves precisely because they believed in the value of compassion? Thus, amidst herbs, prayers, and shared bread, monasteries became islands of care in the midst of a harsh world. And in this setting, a special space stood out as a center of reflection and retreat: the cloister, the silent heart of monastic life. The cloister was the silent heart of the monastery. Imagine a square courtyard
surrounded by arched stone corridors where the wind blew gently and the sound of water from a central fountain echoed almost hypnotically. There, the monks walked in silence, their steps slow, their eyes downcast, as if each turn were a wordless prayer. The cloister wasn't just architecture, it was a living metaphor for seclusion. This space had a practical function, connecting the main areas of the monastery, but its meaning was deeper. It was there that the monks meditated, reflected, and sought clarity. The silence of the cloister was different from that of the church. It was an open air silence, where the visible sky reminded them of the presence of something greater. Today, many seek this same effect in Zen gardens, tranquil parks, or even solitary walks. There was also something symbolic about the square shape, always closed in on itself. Each corridor represented a cycle, a constant return to the center. This repetition taught discipline. No matter how far one walked, one always returned to the same point. Anyone who has tried to meditate knows how similar it is. Thoughts come and go, but one must always return to the breath, to the present. The cloister was the monastery's breathing. The fountain in the center, often simple, represented life springing forth amidst silence. The unhurriedly flowing water reminded us that time doesn't have to be noisy to be powerful. Many monks would spend hours simply observing or listening to this constant sound. Interestingly, today we find something similar in meditation apps that use the sound of water or wind to calm the mind. This space also served as a place of passage, and therein lay its genius. Even in ordinary tasks, crossing from the dormitory to the refectory, or from the library to the chapel, the monk was reminded, by the mere surroundings, of the importance of seclusion. It was as if the architecture itself educated the mind, without the need for words. Thus the cloister became more than stone and water. It was a silent teacher, but it did not exist in isolation. Its rhythm, its movements, were connected to something even greater, the liturgy of the hours, which marked each moment of monastic life with spiritual precision. The liturgy of the hours was like the monastery's spiritual clock. 7 times a day, the monks would interrupt what they were doing to pray together in unison, psalms and hymns that marked each phase of the journey. From the night vigils to the evening prayers, each moment had its place. Time was not left to chance. It was sacred, divided, structured. It was as if each toll of the bell were a comma in the sentence of life. The meaning of this was profound. Instead of living improvised life, the monk learned to organize his hours around the divine. Today, when we use planners, calendars, and apps to organize our routines, we do something similar, but almost always in pursuit of productivity. The monks, however, sought presence. Each hour prayed was a reminder that life is made of conscious pauses, not just rush. But the liturgy also brought unity. Upon entering the chapel, everyone was equal: the abbot, the novice, the eldest monk. There was no distinction, only voices mingling. Gregorian chant filled the air, slow, repetitive, yet deeply engaging. Anyone who has participated in a choir or heard a crowd sing the same song in unison understands the power of this collective sound. It dissolves the I and strengthens the we. Interestingly, repetition wasn't seen as boring. On the contrary, it was a source of stability. Just as an athlete practices the same movements every day, or a musician repeats scales, the monk prayed the same words, finding ever-increasing depth in them. It's like rereading a favorite book. With each reading, a new layer of meaning emerges. This rhythm also shaped our perception of time. The day wasn't just morning, afternoon, and night. It was a mosaic of sacred moments. This vision provokes us. Couldn't we also divide our days into small, purposeful pauses, not just chasing the clock, but pausing at certain moments to give thanks, reflect, or simply breathe? Thus, the liturgy of the hours was not just prayer, it was the backbone of monastic life. But of course, this rhythm only worked because everyone obeyed a central authority responsible for maintaining order and discipline: the abbot, an essential figure in the life of every monk. In the monastery, the abbot was more than a leader. He was seen as a spiritual father. His word carried the weight of law, not because it was imposed by force, but because it symbolized the very voice of the rule of Saint Benedict. The monks saw him as a guide, someone who constantly reminded the community of its greater purpose. To obey the abbot was, therefore, to obey the order that sustained monastic life. This obedience did not imply blind servitude. On the contrary, it was understood as an exercise in humility. The monk learned to set aside his own ego to live in harmony with others. It's similar to when we follow a mentor or teacher we trust. We let go of our stubbornness because we recognize that person has walked the path before us. In the monastery, the abbot was this experienced guide. The abbot also had the role of balancing rigor and mercy. When a monk erred, he was not simply punished, but guided. Discipline existed, of course, but it was accompanied by care. Today, good business leaders are remembered precisely for this, not only for their ability to demand results, but also for inspiring, correcting, and supporting at the same time. It's a leadership that combines firmness and humanity. The abbot's presence provided stability to the group. In a community where everyone wore the same dress, performed the same duties, and followed the same rules, someone was needed to make decisions in difficult times. Imagine an entire community without leadership. The risk of disorganization would be enormous. The abbot was the linchpin that held the circle together. His responsibility was so great that his life was also a constant exercise in vigilance and sacrifice. Obedience in this context was seen as a path to freedom. It may seem contradictory, but relinquishing one's own will helped the monk free himself from the anxiety of always choosing. By trusting the abbot, he also trusted his own purpose. It's a bit like following a well-structured routine. It may seem limiting at first, but we soon realize it gives us security. And this central figure wasn't limited to discipline. The abbot also cared for the spiritual life, encouraged confession, and accompanied penance. He was a guide beyond the rules, a mirror for the monks to seek their own inner transformation. In the monastery, confession was a natural part of the routine, almost like breathing. Monks would appear before the abbot or a designated confessor to expose their failings, not only serious sins but also everyday slip-ups. Speaking softly, acknowledging an impure thought, admitting an inattention during prayer, all of this was brought to light. The idea was simple: not to let small shadows turn into storms. This practice carried enormous psychological weight. Imagine being able to empty your mind daily without carrying guilt or hidden thought. By confessing, the monk freed himself from the weight of his conscience and returned to a lighter life. Today, something similar happens when we vent to a trusted friend or when we write in a journal. The simple act of expressing ourselves is liberate. Penance, in turn, was the complement to confession. It wasn't enough to talk, it was necessary to act. Often, this meant extra fasting, prolonged prayers, or additional tasks. The goal wasn't cruel punishment, but rather character training, as when someone decides to correct a mistake by apologizing, changing an attitude, or making amends in some way. Penance was a reminder that true repentance is demonstrated by actions. This confession routine also created a more honest community. After all, everyone knew that, at some point, they would have to open up. This reduced the chance of masks, intrigue, or resentment. The silence of the cloister was reinforced by the transparency between the brothers. Anyone who has lived in a group knows how much a lack of dialogue can corrode relationships. In the monastery, this space for openness was almost an antidote to conflict. It's interesting to note that even in such rigid practices, there was room for compassion. The abbot was not only a judge, he was also a counselor. He guided, listened, and helped each monk see their blind spots. It's similar to the relationship between a modern therapist and their patient. It's not enough to point out problems, it's necessary to offer paths. Thus, confession and penance became a school of self-knowledge, and within this school of discipline and renunciation, there were even deeper vows that guided monastic life. Among them, one of the most radical and symbolic, the vow of poverty, which shaped the monk's entire relationship with the material world. At the heart of monastic life was the vow of poverty. Upon entering the monastery, a monk relinquished all his possessions, clothes, land, coins, even objects of sentimental value. Nothing belonged to him individually. Everything became the community. It was a radical act, but one laden with meaning, freeing oneself from the burden of possessions to live fully in simplicity. This detachment was more than a rule, it was inner training. After all, the more things we accumulate, the more worries we carry. The monk understood this early on. By having nothing, he didn't need to worry about losing anything. It was like carrying a light backpack, while the rest of the world dragged baggage full of desires and anxiety. Today, minimalism attempts to revive this same principle, but monks have been practicing it for centuries. Of course, this choice wasn't easy. Many novices coming from wealthy families found the lack of personal belongings strained. Imagine trading embroidered clothes for a thick woolen habit, or trading a soft bed for a simple board. But over time, they learned that true wealth lay in the freedom of not depending on these things. It was a hard but transformative learning experience. This vow also brought a sense of equality. Within the monastery, there were neither rich nor poor, noble nor serf. Everyone wore the same clothes, ate the same food, and slept in the same beds. This homogeneity broke down social barriers that, outside, were practically insurmountable. It was as if the monastery were a space of silent justice, where each person's worth came not from what they possessed, but from what they were. Interestingly, this detachment didn't mean rejecting the material world, but using it wisely. The monks still worked the land, produced objects, and cared for collective goods. The difference is that none of this was accumulated for their own benefit. Everything served the community and charity. It's a logic that still challenges us today. Do we possess things? And in this process of renunciation, another challenge arose. Teaching the younger ones, the novices, to follow this same path of discipline and detachment. After all, training new monks meant ensuring the continuation of this life dedicated to silence and faith. When a young man entered the monastery as a novice, he did not immediately receive the full habit or assume all the vows. First came the apprenticeship, a period of intense discipline that served as a test. The novice was observed in silence, work, and prayer. It was a time to shape character, like clay in the hands of the potter. The rule of Saint Benedict stated, "One must test the spirit before accepting the definitive commitment." The discipline was rigorous, but not without purpose. The novice learned to rise early, to endure the cold of the dormitory, to eat simply, to obey without question. Every detail of the routine was part of the training. Imagine someone who had never lived without the comfort of their own bed, or their own family, suddenly having to adapt to silence, repetition, and detachment. It was a shock, but also an awakening. This process served as a filter. Many gave up, unable to handle the pace, and this wasn't seen as a failure, but as clarity. Better to leave early than to promise something that wouldn't be fulfilled. It's similar to modern internships, where the apprentice discovers whether a career truly suits them. The monastery didn't force permanence, it offered choice, but demanded sincerity. Those who remained little by little were molded by the habit of discipline. They learned that strength lies not in doing what one wants, but in persevering in what is right. The novice who endured the discomfort of the beginning became, over time, more resilient, more patient, and more centered. This formation was not only spiritual but also human. It prepared the young man to be not only a monk but a whole human being. And there was also the role of example. The novice learned not only from written rules, but also by observing his elders. He saw how they walked in silence, how they prayed with concentration, how they worked without complaint. This learning through experience was powerful. After all, who hasn't learned more from practice than from theory? The monastery was, above all, a living school. Thus, through discipline and example, the novices were formed, and in this learning process, there was a space that further reinforced the value of wisdom. The monastic libraries, veritable treasures of knowledge preserved throughout the Middle Ages. Monastery libraries were much more than mere repositories of books. They were veritable vaults of knowledge, stored silently within cold stone walls. The monks treated each manuscript as a relic, knowing that in times of war and destruction, that piece of parchment might be the only existing copy of a text. The smell of dry ink, the rough feel of the pages, and the creaking of the bookshelves lent the atmosphere an aura of reverence. In the Middle Ages, books were extremely rare. There were no printing presses or bookstores. Each copy was copied by hand, letter by letter, in a slow process that could take months or even years. Therefore, a monastic library, even with just a few dozen volumes, was already considered a priceless treasure. Imagine today a home without internet or television, but only a small bookshelf filled with precious books. For the monks, this space was worth more than gold. These libraries held more than just religious texts. They also contained philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and even classical works from antiquity. Thanks to this zeal, writings by Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero have survived. If it weren't for the patient dedication of copyist monks, much of Western knowledge would have been lost. It's curious to think that while castles crumbled and empires fell, these silent men ensured the survival of humanity's memory. The library was also a space for daily study. The monk could spend hours reading and meditating on a single sentence. There was no rush, no multitasking. It was a deep connection with the text, almost like an intimate dialogue with the author. Today, when many read on fast-paced screens jumping from one tab to another, we forget how powerful it is to dedicate oneself calmly to a reading. Reading slowly was for them a form of prayer. Furthermore, these spaces of learning shaped the future. Young novices learned not only to copy but also to interpret. By handling manuscripts, they developed discipline, patience, and a love of knowledge. It's like when a child, still young, discovers a love of reading.
The difference is that in the monastery it happened in absolute silence, under candlelight and the distant sound of wind hitting the wall. Thus, monastic libraries were not only places of study, but also fortresses against oblivion. And along with books came another equally important mission, ensuring that precious texts from antiquity and Christianity were preserved for future generations. In the Middle Ages, when many cities burned in wars and invasions, monks became silent guardians of knowledge. While chaos reigned outside the walls, within them patient hands copied text by ancient philosophers, physicians, and mathematicians. It wasn't just religious devotion, it was a commitment to human memory. Thanks to this nearly invisible work, ideas from centuries past have reached us intact.
Classical texts from authors such as Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, or Galen were not seen as threats to faith, but as sources of wisdom that could engage with spirituality. The copyist monk, by reproducing each line, not only preserved but also absorbed these thoughts. It was as if each quill dipped in ink was a thread of continuity between different civilizations. Today, when we talk about backup or cloud storage, we forget that the first backup was made by hand, letter by letter. This endeavor presented enormous challenges. Parchment was expensive, lighting was poor, and errors were difficult to correct. Yet, they persevered. Many manuscripts bear small notes in the margins, revealing weariness or mood. I'm cold. My hands hurt. Thank God, this book is finished. These phrases remind us that behind this monumental work, there were human beings struggling with boredom and physical exertion. Conservation was not only technical, but also symbolic. Copying texts was a way to keep the flame of knowledge alive in dark times. It's as if each word were a brick that prevented the bridge between the past and the future from collapsing. Without the monks, we might never have read Aristotle's Politics, the works of Cicero, or the medical treatises that inspired generations of scholars. Interestingly, this zeal resonates to this day. When teachers insist that students read classics, or when digital libraries preserve rare works, they are echoing the same monastic spirit, the conviction that knowledge must be protected from oblivion. The difference is that now we use technology, but the essence remains the same, saving words to save ideas. Thus, between pen and parchment, the monks were the invisible engineers of memory. But the monastery's discipline didn't rely solely on books. They also took care with spoken words, limited to the bare minimum by the rigorous practice of silence. In the monastery, speaking was a luxury. Rules dictated long periods of silence, and when voices were unavailable, gestures were the only option. A hand movement indicated food, another pointed to objects, and even discrete signs were created for specific tasks. Interestingly, instead of disrupting, this created a more harmonious environment. The noise of speech was replaced by a kind of silent choreography. This restriction wasn't punishment, but training. Silence helped the monks tame their impulsive words. Anyone who has regretted something said in the heat of the moment understands the value of this. By speaking little, each sentence carried weight, each word measured. It's almost the opposite of today's world, where we mindlessly dump messages and audio messages into WhatsApp group. There, speaking was a rare, precious act. Communication through gestures also reinforced community. Everyone had to be attentive, interpreting signs and movements carefully. It was an exercise in listening without ears, in paying attention without words. Imagine a refectory with dozens of monks, where no one speaks, but everyone understands each other with only glances and nods. This type of coexistence created invisible bonds of respect and harmony. And there was also a spiritual effect. External silence helped cultivate internal silence. By not being distracted by conversations, the monk immersed himself in himself, observing thoughts and feelings. Today, practices such as silent retreats or long meditations follow the same logic. When the mouth is silent, the mind has space to reorganize itself. The body learns to hear what is normally drowned out by daily noise. But not everything was rigid. There were moments allowed for speaking, especially during confessions, studies, or in councils with the app. The difference is that, in these moments, the words came with more clarity and depth, precisely because they were not wasted. It's like when someone spends hours in silence, and when they speak, everyone stops to listen. The weight of the pause gives the voice more value. Thus, the discipline of silence shaped not only the environment, but also the soul. And within this environment, when the voice emerged, it often came not in speech, but in song. Gregorian chant, one of the most striking expressions of monastic life. Gregorian chant was the voice of the monastery instead of instruments. Only male voices echoed together, in unison, unhurried, without vanity. The notes rose and fell slowly, like gentle waves that lulled the soul. Imagine entering a cold stone church and hearing that deep, low sound that seemed to come not from men but from the space itself. It was prayer transformed into melody. This music sought not spectacle but solitude. There were no solos, no applause, no virtuosity. Each monk erased his own ego to unite with the collective. The beauty lay in its simplicity, a melodic line, repeated, that gradually hypnotized. Anyone who has heard it knows Gregorian chant doesn't move like opera, but it soothes, leading to introspection. It's as if the sound created an invisible bridge between earth and heaven. Interestingly, this musical style was the basis for much of what we call Western music today. Scales, notation, rhythm, everything had its beginnings there. But for the monks, this was only a means, not an end. The goal was to pray through singing, to transform words into vibration. It was as if each syllable were offered like invisible incense, slowly rising upward. Listening to or chanting Gregorian chants was a complete sensory experience. The echo of voices filled the space. The cold stones seemed to vibrate with it. The silence between one phrase and the next was as important as the music itself. Today, many turn to playlists of relaxing sounds to sleep or study. In the monastery, this soundtrack was natural, alive, part of the day, and there was also a communal aspect, singing, united, leveled, no matter the age, origin, or voice. Everyone was on the same melodic line. It was the opposite of individualism. What mattered was harmony, not distinction. Perhaps that's why so many describe Gregorian chant as something that heals the mind, because it dissolves the I into the. Thus, amidst deep sounds and profound silences, Gregorian chant marked monastic life. But not everything was so perfect. Over time, monasteries also faced controversies, especially linked to the wealth that contradictorily began to accumulate behind those walls of simplicity. Despite their vow of poverty, many monasteries accumulated land, gold, and privileges over the centuries. Pilgrims left donations. Nobles offered properties in exchange for prayers for their souls, and soon some cloisters became veritable centers of economic power. Imagine the contrast. Inside, monks dressed in thick wool, living simply. Outside, full granaries, heavy coffers, and vast estates. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. Many criticized the monks for accumulating wealth while preaching detachment. It was as if the very essence of monastic life was being put to the test. In some ways, it recalls current debates about institutions
that preach simplicity but accumulate fortunes. The tension between discourse and practice is as old as humanity itself. Some monasteries use their resources for charity, feeding the poor, hosting travelers, maintaining hospitals. In this case, wealth was transformed into service, but this wasn't always the case. In some cases, accumulated wealth was converted into luxury, imposing buildings, or political privileges. This generated controversy within and outside the church, even fueling reform movements. The truth is that power attracts dispute. Wealthy monasteries became targets of invasions, tax collections, and even the greed of kings. Monks, seeking solitude and prayer, found themselves embroiled in negotiations, defenses, and alliance. The outside world, which they sought to escape, returned knocking on their doors in the form of wealth and power. This reality shows that human beings, even in disciplined environments, are not immune to temptation. Wealth, when mismanaged, undermined the essence of monastic life, and it was precisely this tension that led to renewal movements, where new orders sought to recover the original simplicity of Saint Benedict. It was like a cycle: discipline, accumulation, criticism, reform. Thus, between virtue and contradiction, monasteries demonstrated that even the most sacred spaces could be challenged by the weight of gold, and from these tensions arose monastic reforms, which sought to purify life behind the walls once again. As time passed, many monasteries moved away from their original simplicity. Comfort grew, rules relaxed, and the spirit of discipline was lost. It was then that reform movements emerged, attempts to reclaim the essence of monastic life. It was like returning to the roots, cutting out the excesses, rediscovering the purity of the beginning. Thus, orders like the Cistercians were born, seeking to return to a life of rigor and austerity. These reforms were harsh but necessary. Silence was seriously restored, manual labor regained importance, and prayer was once again the center of everything. Imagine a monastery that had become almost a small court, full of privileges, suddenly returning to basics: simple bread, rough habits, days of labor in the fields. It was a shock, but also a rebirth. The power of these reforms lay in reminding us that monastic life was not about power or status, but about discipline and spirituality. It's similar to what happens when someone, after losing themselves in excess, decides to reorganize their life. They cut out distractions, resume good habits, and rediscover clarity. The reforms were on a community scale, a spiritual fresh start. Not everyone accepted these changes easily. There was resistance, criticism, even divisions. After all, giving up privileges is never an easy task. But little by little, the spirit of renewal found support, especially among those who saw relaxation as a threat to their faith. It was a struggle between accommodation and transformation, the silent but decisive battle. These reforms left profound scars. They remind us that no institution, no matter how sacred it may seem, is immune to the ravages of time. It's always necessary to return to its origins, revise its purposes, and rediscover its meaning. It's a lesson that applies to us as well. How often do we need to reform our own routines, eliminate the superfluous, and return to the essential? Thus, the history of monastic reforms shows that even silence needs constant renewal. But even after the adjustments, the monks' isolation from the outside world remained one of the most striking aspects of monastic life. Living in the monastery meant closing the door to the outside world. Monks left behind family, friends, possessions, and even their own names. In some cases,
The isolation was not only physical, but also symbolic. Upon passing through the stone gates, The monk assumed a separate life, dedicated entirely to prayer and work. The outside world continued to revolve, with wars, festivals, and markets. But for them, all of this was distant, almost irrelevant. This isolation had its protective side. Within the walls, there was stability amidst the chaos. While villages were sacked or kingdoms changed hands, the monastery maintained the same rhythm day after day, century after century. It was like living on an island outside of time. Many sought this refuge precisely to escape the instability of the Middle Ages. Today, some find something similar in spiritual retreats or in periods of digital detox when they turn off their cell phones and social media to rediscover silence. But isolation also came at a cost. Many monks never saw their families again. The lack of contact with the world brought longing and at times loneliness. It was a high price for a life of discipline. Imagine giving up all the everyday conversations, the casual encounters, the stories shared with neighbors. Absolute silence was both a blessing and a challenge. Interestingly, this separation from the outside world increased the monks' authority over it. Precisely because they lived apart, they were seen as holy men, guardians of secrets and wisdom. Kings, nobles, and peasants sought their advice, asked for prayers, and sought blessings. It's as if isolation created an aura of respect. The less they were present in the world, the more the world sought them out. This paradox, being distant yet influencing from close quarters, is one of the most intriguing hallmarks of monastic life. To this day, monks and nuns fascinate us because they seem to live in another dimension. Isolation, rather than erasing them, made them reference points. Perhaps because deep down we all miss silence and discipline, and seeing someone living it provokes us. And even in this seclusion, life continued. When the time came for death, the monk received no great honors or grand ceremonies. The end was marked by the same simplicity that had shaped his entire life. Death in the monastery was received without fanfare. When a monk departed, there were no trumpets, no long wakes, no pompous procession. The body was washed in silence, dressed in the same rough habit it had worn in life, and placed in a simple wooden coffin, or in some cases, simply wrapped in a sheet. The message was clear: before eternity, all are equal. The funeral rite took place inside the chapel, amid slow, almost hypnotic, Gregorian chants. The brothers' voices echoed softly, filling the stone space with a serene lament. There were no loud tears, but there was reverence. Each prayer was a farewell. Each sustained note seemed to extend the deceased's memory a little beyond time. It was more silence than grief. Afterwards, the body was taken to the monastery cemetery, usually a simple space lined with identical wooden crosses. There was no distinction between those who rested there. Kings had imposing tombs, warriors were given statues, monks had only a discreet cross and rest in common ground. This simplicity spoke louder than any monument. True greatness lay in the life lived, not the tomb left behind. The burial was attended by all the brothers in silence. The sound of the earth falling onto the coffin was perhaps the most powerful moment, dry, direct, reminding everyone that one day they would also walk the same path. But this sound was not frightening, it was accepted naturally. Death in the monastery was part of the cycle, not a tragedy. This serene outlook on death also shaped his life, knowing that the end would be simple, made each day more valuable. The monk lived knowing that he would leave behind no riches or great titles, but only his discipline, his prayer, and his example. It's a reflection that concerns us all. What will we truly take with us when our time comes? And so, the cycle of monastic life closed, being born into the world, renouncing the world, living in silence, and departing in simplicity. But this ending was not empty. It was a gateway to what they believed to be true life. And it is precisely in this contrast between simplicity and depth that the monastic routine continues to fascinate us to this day. Did you realize that behind the monk's slow and seemingly boring routine lay a powerful wisdom? They showed that discipline isn't a prison, it's freedom, that silence isn't emptiness, it's fertile space, and that repeating the simple every day can transform the mind and heart. Now tell me, are you using your time consciously or just letting it slip through your fingers? What if you applied at least one of these ideas to your life? Maybe waking up a little earlier, creating moments of silence, or even simplifying your lifestyle. Small repeated steps can completely change your routine. After all, if monks centuries ago found peace in the basics, why do we insist on making things so complicated? The question remains, are you willing to challenge yourself to live with more focus and simplicity? Or will you remain trapped in excessive noise, distraction, and rush? Think about it. The answer could be the turning point between living tired or living with purpose. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Here you'll continue learning how ancient stories can bring practical lessons to your life today. Don't just watch, dive in along on this journey.